What actually happens when a classic ghost story is forced to carry the crushing weight of real American history? Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a total masterpiece that completely flips our understanding of a classic literary genre on its head. We're going to see exactly how the legendary Toni Morrison masterfully bends the rules of the Gothic to process profound historical trauma in her Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, Beloved. So if you've ever wanted to understand how fiction can confront, truly unspeakable realities, well, you are absolutely in the right place. 124 was spiteful, full of a baby's venom. Right from that chilling opening line, we are plunged headfirst into this deeply Gothic atmosphere. It's an unbelievably striking way to kick off a story. But here's the thing, this haunting has a devastatingly real foundation. We aren't just dealing with your run-of-the-mill haunted house here. No, we're looking at a physical space saturated with the very real, very human venom of a life tragically cut short.
So here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll step inside a spiteful haunted house. Then, we'll uncover the true historical horror behind the story. After that, we'll see how psychological trauma literally embodies itself, face the real monster of slavery, and finally, look at how Morrison completely rewrites the Gothic genre.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, A Spiteful Haunted House, setting the scene. To truly appreciate Morrison's genius, we kind of need to take a step back and look at the traditional expectations of the Gothic genre itself. Think back to the classic spooky stories you probably read in school. They rely super heavily on supernatural horrors, crumbling castles, gloomy weather, and some monstrous other threatening the heroes. Morrison takes this familiar framework of gloom and fear, but she's going to inject it with a completely different, much more visceral kind of terror. Picture this, it's 1873 in Cincinnati. Seth, a formerly enslaved woman, and her 18-year-old daughter, Denver, are essentially trapped inside their home at 124 Bluestone Road. The house is literally plagued by a malevolent spirit, a baby ghost. And because of this wild supernatural intrusion, the local community has completely isolated them. I mean, it is the ultimate Gothic entrapment. They are confined in this spiteful house, constantly haunted by an invisible, enraged force. Which brings us to Section 2. The true historical horror, grounding the supernatural. We really have to ground this in reality, and the stark historical anchor of our story starts right here in 1850. That's when the Fugitive Slave Act meant that even if you managed to escape to a free state, you could still be legally hunted down. Then in 1856, a real woman named Margaret Garner fled Kentucky for Ohio. When she was cornered by slave catchers, she made the desperate, tragic decision to kill her own daughter rather than see her dragged back into the extreme cruelties of slavery. Toni Morrison actually found this story in an old newspaper clipping, and that horrific reality became the very seed for Beloved, which is set nearly 2 decades later in 1873. So, the absolutely crucial point Morrison is making here is that the source of this Gothic terror isn't some mythical creature. You can forget about vampires or demons lurking in the shadows. The true monster, the horrifying other in this story, is the unspeakable trauma and the systemic, dehumanizing reality of American slavery. And honestly, those historical facts are far more terrifying than any conventional ghost story could ever be. Let's move on to Section 3, Embodying Psychological Trauma, The Arrival. So how does Morrison pull this off? She deploys some seriously macabre elements. Things like the spiteful ghost, a tombstone that Seth pays for with 10 minutes of physical exploitation, and this horrific act of infanticide driven by a desperate, albeit twisted, maternal love. But she isn't just doing this for cheap jump scares. No, she uses these elements to vividly illustrate how psychological trauma actually fragments a person's sense of self. It shows us, in a really profound way, that the most terrifying hauntings aren't just rattling around in the house. They reside entirely within the mind. Now, looking at this academic analysis, scholar Tseng Tu points out something really fascinating. The characters have incredibly different, highly subjective responses to this supernatural intrusion. When Paul D. arrives at 124, he treats the ghost like a traditional monster, an abominable force that just needs to be violently expelled. But for Seth and Denver, it's just a normalized part of their fractured everyday existence. And then when Beloved suddenly appears on their doorstep as a fully grown young woman, basically the ghost incarnate, the whole Gothic reality shifts from an invisible poltergeist into a physical, all-consuming body. Once Beloved takes this human form, she acts almost like a succubus. It's a terrifying physical manifestation of guilt and unprocessed grief. She literally feeds on Seth, growing physically plumper and more demanding day by day. Meanwhile, Seth practically wastes away, entirely consumed by her desperate need to explain herself to the daughter she murdered. It turns into this incredibly dark, vampiric dynamic. Just listen to Morrison's intensely gothic language for a second, rubies of blood. It perfectly captures how the past, especially when it's left unexamined and just pushed down, will eventually return to violently claw at the present. In a very literal sense within the story, Beloved eats up her mother's life. This brings us to Section 4, The Monster of Slavery, a Fragmented Self. You see, the institution of slavery splits a person into a fragmented figure. Because these characters were denied a basic narrative of being, denied their own actual selfhood under slavery, their repressed memories cause a violent fragmentation of the self. And this trauma bubbles up in bizarre ways: a loss of chronological time, total psychological dissociation, and the incredibly heavy burden of generational violence. Beloved eagerly sweeps up all of these fragmented pieces, taking the collective trauma of the community and reflecting it right back at them. Ultimately, Beloved becomes this massive repository for unresolved feelings on a collective scale. She even begins voicing the horrific historical reality of the Middle Passage, literally speaking for the 60 million and more who died during the transatlantic slave trade. She trespasses right over realistic time boundaries, totally blending the identity of a murdered toddler with the countless ancestors who suffered in the dark holds of those slave ships. It is haunting on a massive scale. And finally, let's look at Section 5, Rewriting the Gothic Genre, Exorcism and Healing. This right here is where we see Morrison's ultimate subversion of the genre. While a traditional Gothic tale usually ends in predictable doom, destruction, and simply destroying the monster, Morrison uses the genre for a completely different purpose. She forces a confrontation with the past that ultimately paves the way for healing. At the climax, the local women of the community gather outside 124, but they aren't there to destroy Seth. They are there to exorcise Beloved, effectively helping Seth process those incredibly dark, traumatic memories. As the scholarly analysis explores, by allowing the Gothic other to actually be resurrected, seen, and heard, the novel clears a path for a true rebirth. It's a revivification of vitality. Once the community finally steps in, and that unspoken horror is spoken out loud, Beloved vanishes. This allows Denver to step out into the real world as an independent adult, and crucially, it allows Seth to finally hear Paul D. tell her that she is her own best thing. They finally escape their cycle of stagnation. Morrison showed us that the Gothic doesn't just have to be about fear and gloom. It can actually be a powerful tool to reconstruct a shattered identity. So I want to leave you with this thought. If a ghost story can be used to process the deepest scars of human history, how else might we bend the stories we tell to finally heal ourselves? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.